Growing up, I always believed I lived in the perfect home, surrounded by love and stability. My family felt like the kind people dreamed about, an image of warmth and happiness. My name is Emily, and in my eyes, my parents were the two most amazing people in the world. My dad, Mark, was a pillar of strength, a hard-working man who dedicated himself fully to providing for our family. He had a quiet authority that made me feel safe just by being near him. Then there was my mom, Sarah. She was the heart of our household, warm, nurturing, and always making sure everything ran smoothly. She cooked meals that brought us together, kept the house tidy and bright, and created a loving environment where we could all feel close. For as long as I could remember, they were the perfect match. They defied the odds of modern relationships: no fighting, no drama, just pure, unconditional love. Or so it seemed. I admired my dad growing up. He was my hero. When I was little, I used to follow him around the house, trying to help with small tasks. Whether it was fixing the car or mowing the lawn, or starting one of his DIY projects that he loved but never quite finished, I was his little shadow. As I grew older, our bond shifted. Our conversations became deeper, more personal. We talked about life, his dreams, and my future subjects that, looking back, felt a bit too intimate for a father-daughter relationship, but at the time, I didn't question it. Dad was always there for me, especially when Mom was busy or too tired to listen. Our connection felt different from what I had with her, and I didn't think much of it until one quiet afternoon when things began to change. It was a Sunday, and Mom had gone to visit a friend, leaving Dad and me alone in the house. Normally, it wouldn't have been unusual. We'd spent plenty of time alone before, but that day felt different. Dad's gaze lingered on me longer than it should have, and his smile was off. It was subtle, but enough for me to feel something had shifted. I brushed it off at first, convincing myself I was imagining things. After all, Dad had never been anything but kind and caring. But as days passed, more little things started to stand out. The way he brushed my hair from my face when we talked, how his hugs lasted a second longer than they used to, or how he began seeking my company more often. It wasn't anything overt or inappropriate, but there was a growing tension between us that I couldn't quite explain. I started to question whether I was overthinking things, maybe imagining a new dynamic that wasn't really there. Yet the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the sense that something was off between us, something that wasn't quite right. As the weeks passed, the uneasy feeling I had only grew stronger. Dad's behavior remained subtle, nothing that could be called inappropriate, but there was this undeniable tension in the air. I began to withdraw a little, spending more time in my room, trying to avoid situations where it would just be the two of us. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, those small moments of awkward closeness kept creeping in. What made things worse was the growing distance between my parents. Mom, who had always been warm and full of energy, was becoming more distant. She wasn't as cheerful. Her laughter no longer filled the house like it used to. At first, I thought maybe she was just tired or stressed, but then I started noticing the way she would watch Dad and me. Her gaze was sharp, filled with suspicion and unease, like she was seeing something I wasn't. When Dad and I laughed together or spent a little too much time talking in the kitchen, her eyes would narrow, and the air would grow heavy with unspoken words. It wasn't just me who noticed the shift. Dad became quieter, more reserved around Mom. He'd retreat into his office or find something to fix in the garage, avoiding the house whenever he could. The once easygoing atmosphere of our home turned tense and cold. The warmth that had made our house feel like a safe haven began to fade, replaced by an almost palpable sense of something wrong, something broken. One evening, I walked into the living room after dinner, where Mom sat, staring at the TV but not really watching. I could see the tension etched on her face. I sat down beside her, hoping to break the ice. "Mom, are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I already knew the answer. She glanced at me briefly before turning back to the TV, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Everything's fine, Emily," she said, but her tone was sharp, brittle. I frowned, not convinced. "You've been really quiet lately. Is something wrong?" There was a long silence, and I thought she might just brush me off again, but then she sighed, a deep, tired sound, and turned to face me fully. Her eyes, usually so soft and kind, now seemed guarded. "Has anything been different between you and your father?" she asked suddenly, her voice low but steady. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to process what she was asking. "What do you mean?" I replied, feigning ignorance. She studied my face carefully as if searching for something. I've seen the way you'd have been lately. The way he looks at you, how you act around him. Her voice wavered slightly, but her gaze never faltered. I just need to know if something's been going on. Something you're not telling me. I felt a rush of panic. Did she know? Could she see the same strange dynamic I had been feeling? I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but my throat tightened, and I couldn't find the words. Mom, nothing's happening, I managed to say, though even to me, my voice sounded unsure. She didn't say anything for a moment, just kept looking at me, and I could see the hurt, the suspicion in her eyes. All right, she finally said, though her tone made it clear she didn't believe me. But if there is something, anything, Emily, you need to tell me. I nodded even though my mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I wanted to reassure her, to make everything go back to normal, but how could I, when I wasn't even sure what was happening myself? As I left the room that night, I felt the full weight of the cracks forming in our family. They weren't just subtle anymore, they were real and they were growing, and I had no idea how to stop them. The days following my conversation with Mom were a blur of tension and uncertainty. The uneasy feeling in our house had become almost unbearable. Every interaction between my parents seemed strained, filled with an underlying anger or frustration that neither of them would address directly. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, knowing something awful was about to happen but being powerless to stop it. Dad, once the center of my world, had become more distant too, though not in the same way as Mom. He seemed conflicted, torn between two emotions I couldn't quite read. One minute, he'd be his usual, easygoing self, offering to help me with homework or discussing some new project idea. The next, I'd catch him watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was subtle, but there was something in his eyes, a strange mix of pride and something darker. It was almost as if I had become more than just his daughter in his eyes, though I couldn't bring myself to believe that was true. I didn't want to believe it. One afternoon, I came home from school to find Dad in the kitchen, cooking dinner. That in itself was unusual. Mom was usually the one who handled meals. He smiled when he saw me, but there was something off about the way his eyes lingered on me. Hey, he said, his voice too casual. Thought I'd surprise you guys with dinner tonight. Your mom's been tired lately. I forced a smile. That's nice of you. He nodded, stirring a pot of sauce on the stove. Why don't you sit down? We haven't really talked in a while. I hesitated, my heart thudding uncomfortably in my chest. Something about the way he said it felt wrong, but I pushed the feeling aside and sat down at the kitchen island, watching him move around the kitchen. So, how's school? He asked, his back to me as he chopped vegetables. Fine, I said, trying to keep my tone light, nothing too exciting. He turned around, wiping his hands on a towel, and leaned against the counter. His eyes met mine, and I felt that familiar, unsettling tension. You know, you can talk to me about anything, you don't have to keep things from me. There it was again, that strange, too personal tone that had started creeping into our conversations. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, avoiding his gaze. I know, Dad, everything's fine. He didn't respond right away, just kept looking at me with that same unreadable expression. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Good, I just want you to know that I'm here for you. I nodded, my throat tight, thanks. The silence between us stretched, awkward and heavy, until finally, he turned back to the stove, breaking the tension. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and excused myself to my room, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to confront. As I lay on my bed, staring up at the ceiling, I thought back to the conversation with Mom. Her words echoed in my mind. I've seen the way he looks at you, how you act around him. At the time, I had brushed it off, convinced she was overreacting, but now I wasn't so sure. Was I the one in denial? Had things between Dad and me shifted in a way I hadn't fully recognized? The door creaked open, and I sat up, startled. It was Mom. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes tired and sad. Can I come in? She asked softly. I nodded, my heart sinking as she stepped inside and sat on the edge of my bed. I need to talk to you, Emily, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's important. I swallowed hard, bracing myself for whatever was coming. I've been noticing things, she continued, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Between you and your father, I don't know if it's intentional or if you're even aware of it, but something's not right, and I need you to be honest with me. My stomach clenched. Mom, she held up a hand, cutting me off. I'm not accusing you of anything, I just ... I need to know if you felt anything strange, anything that doesn't feel normal. I froze, my mind racing. I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was imagining things, but deep down, I knew I couldn't. The truth, the one I had been avoiding for weeks, was starting to surface, and I couldn't push it down anymore. I don't know, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Maybe things have felt different. Mom's face crumpled, and she reached out to take my hand. Emily, I'm so sorry, I should have said something sooner. I should have done something. I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. It's not your fault, Mom, I don't even know what's happening. She squeezed my hand tightly, her voice breaking. We'll figure it out, I promise, we'll figure this out. In that moment, I realized that the cracks in our family were no longer just beneath the surface. They were right there, in plain sight, and the weight of them was crushing us all. The days that followed were the most difficult I had ever experienced. The silence in our house was deafening, broken only by the occasional clatter of dishes or the rustling of papers. Mom and Dad barely spoke to each other. It was like we were three strangers living under one roof, all too afraid to confront the growing tension between us. I avoided Dad as much as possible. Every time I was alone with him, I could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on me, suffocating. His attempts at normal conversation felt forced, and the looks he gave me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. Whether it was in his mind or mine, I didn't know, but the dynamic between us had shifted, and there was no going back. One evening, I found myself sitting on my bed, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, both outside and within our home. I heard the muffled sound of my parents' voices downstairs, low, angry murmurs that I couldn't quite make out. It had become a routine by now, their hushed arguments that they thought I couldn't hear. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by my mother's raised voice. I can't do this anymore, Richard, she shouted, her voice breaking. I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this was at the moment everything was about to fall apart. I could hear my dad's voice, calmer but with an edge of frustration. Linda, you're overreacting, he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of my mom's anger. Nothing has happened, you're imagining things. I crept to the top of the stairs, my heart racing as I strained to hear their conversation. Mom's voice was trembling, a mix of fury and pain. Don't lie to me, she said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. I've seen the way you look at her, and don't tell me I'm imagining it. You've been pulling away from me for months, it's like you don't even see me anymore. There was a long silence, and for a moment I thought the argument was over. But then Dad's voice came, quieter, almost pleading. Linda, I love you, he said, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. I love Emily too, but not in the way you're thinking. You're wrong about this. You don't love me, Mom snapped, at least not the way you used to. And I don't think I can forgive you for that. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stop the sobs that were threatening to escape. The pain in her voice was unbearable, and the worst part was that I couldn't stop it. I couldn't fix any of this. Without warning, there was the sound of footsteps, and I hurried back into my room, closing the door behind me just as my mom appeared at the bottom of the stairs. Moments later, she was in my room, her face pale, eyes red-rimmed from crying. Emily, she said softly, her voice trembling, we need to talk. I nodded, sitting on the edge of my bed as she closed the door behind her. The weight of the moment hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. Mom, I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice barely audible. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. It's not your fault, sweetheart. None of this is your fault, but I can't stay here anymore. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? I'm leaving, she said, her voice breaking. I can't stay in this house with him, not after everything that's happened. The reality of her words crashed over me, and I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. But what about me? She hesitated, pain etched on her face. You can stay here if you want, Emily, or you can come with me, but I won't force you to choose. Tears welled up in my eyes. I didn't want to choose. How could I? How could I choose between my parents when everything felt so broken, so impossible? I don't know what to do, I whispered, my voice cracking. I don't know what's happening anymore. Mom wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into a tight embrace. I know, baby, I know, but you don't have to make a decision right now. Just know that whatever you decide, I'll be here for you. I clung to her, feeling like a little girl again, lost in a world that was spinning out of control. The warmth of her hug was comforting, but it didn't erase the pain, the confusion, or the fear of what was to come. As she pulled away, she looked at me with a sadness that broke my heart. "I'll be packing my things tonight," she said quietly, "and I'll leave in the morning." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. My mind was reeling, trying to process what this meant, what it would mean for our family, for my relationship with Dad, for everything. And just like that, the cracks in our family that had been growing beneath the surface had finally broken open, shattering everything I thought I knew. The next morning felt surreal, like I was trapped in a dream I couldn't wake up from. The house, once filled with the sounds of a family going about their daily routines, was eerily silent. Mom had stayed true to her word. By the time I got up, her suitcases were already by the door, and she was in the kitchen, making coffee, her face expressionless. I stood in the doorway, watching her move through the motions as if this was just another ordinary day. But it wasn't. Nothing would ever be ordinary again. "Good morning," she said softly, not looking up from the coffee pot. Her voice was calm, but there was a tension beneath it, like she was holding herself together by sheer will. "Morning," I replied, my voice small. I didn't know what to say. There were 1,000 things running through my mind, 1,000 questions I wanted to ask, but none of them felt right. All I could do was stand there, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Mom glanced at me, her eyes softening as she took in my uncertainty. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, though I knew she already knew the answer. I nodded, though I didn't mean it. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I guess I don't know how I'm supposed to feel." Mom sighed and turned off the coffee pot, walking over to me. She pulled me into a hug, and for a moment, I felt like a little girl again, like everything would be okay if I just stayed in her arms long enough. But the truth was, nothing was okay. Nothing had been okay for a long time. "I'm sorry, Emily," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't want it to be like this. I never wanted this for you." I pulled away, wiping at my eyes. "It's not your fault, Mom, I just ... I wish I understood what's happening." Her expression tightened, and for a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something, like there was something more she wanted to explain. But then she shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's complicated, sweetheart. But you're not to blame for any of this. Don't ever think you are." I nodded, though the weight of guilt still sat heavy on my chest. I wasn't sure if it was because of Dad or because of the situation we had all found ourselves in, but it was there, gnawing at me like a silent accusation. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, and both of us turned to see Dad standing at the bottom of the stairs. He looked worn out, dark circles under his eyes and his face drawn. His gaze lingered on Mom for a moment before he shifted his attention to me. "Morning, Emily," he said, his voice rough like he hadn't slept. "Morning," I replied, though my voice felt distant. There was an unspoken tension between them, thick and suffocating, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us anymore. Mom straightened up, smoothing out her blouse as if she were preparing for a business meeting instead of leaving her family. "I'll be out of here soon," she said quietly, her words directed more toward Dad than to me. Dad frowned, his eyes clouded with regret. "Linda ... do you really have to do this?" "Yes," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "I can't stay here, Richard, not like this, not anymore." There was a moment of silence that stretched on, thick and painful. Dad looked like he wanted to say something, to stop her, but the words never came. Maybe he knew, deep down, that there was no point. Mom turned back to me, her expression softening once more. "I'll call you later today, okay? I'll be staying at Aunt Susan's for a little while until I figure things out. You can come visit anytime, or ... you can stay with me if you want." I bit my lip, feeling the pressure of the decision I had to make. I think I'll stay here for now," I said hesitantly, though the thought of being alone with Dad made my stomach twist. She nodded, though I could see the flicker of hurt in her eyes. "I understand, but I'm just a phone call away, okay?" "Okay," I whispered. With that, she grabbed her bags, one in each hand, and headed for the door. She paused for a moment, looking back at Dad. He stood there, watching her go, his expression a mix of sorrow and resignation. "Goodbye, Richard," she said softly. "Goodbye, Linda," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. And then she was gone. Just like that, the door closed behind her, and the sound of her car pulling out of the driveway echoed through the empty house. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the door, half expecting her to come back, to change her mind. But she didn't. She was gone, and with her, the last semblance of our family went too. Dad finally broke the silence, clearing his throat awkwardly. Do you want some breakfast? He asked, his voice strained. I shook my head. No, I'm not hungry. He nodded, though he looked like he didn't know what to do with himself. Okay, well if you need anything, I'll be in the garage. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, alone in the quiet house. It was only then that I let the tears fall, the reality of everything finally hitting me. Our family wasn't just broken, it was shattered, and I wasn't sure if we could ever put the pieces back together again. The days that followed my mom's departure felt like an endless blur. I moved through the house like a ghost, each room echoing with memories of what once was. The absence of my mother created a hollow space that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, attending school, hanging out with friends, but I couldn't escape the looming shadows of my broken home. Dad was around more, which should have been comforting, but his presence felt heavy. He tried to engage me in conversation, asking about my day, but there was a tension in the air that made everything feel awkward and strained. Every time he looked at me, I could feel the weight of unsaid words hanging between us, and it left me unsettled. One evening, as I sat in the living room staring blankly at the television, Dad walked in, holding two bowls of ice cream. Thought we could have a little treat, he said, his voice laced with an enthusiasm that felt forced. Thanks, I replied, taking the bowl from him but not bothering to look up. I wasn't really in the mood for ice cream, or anything, for that matter. I felt like I was in a fog, moving through life without really being present. He sat down on the couch beside me, our shoulders brushing. It was a simple gesture, but I could feel the tension between us thicken. I turned my attention to the screen, but I wasn't really watching. My mind was elsewhere, wandering through the chaos that had become my life. After a few moments of silence, Dad cleared his throat. I've been thinking, maybe we could go for a hike this weekend? Just the two of us, get some fresh air. I turned to him, surprised. A hike? I don't know, Dad, I'm kind of busy. Busy with what? He asked, a hint of frustration creeping into his tone. It's just one day, Emily. I thought it might be nice to spend some time together. I hesitated, feeling cornered. It's just. Everything feels weird right now. I don't know if I want to do that. I understand, he said softly, but I could tell he was disappointed. I just want to make sure we're okay. You and me, do you think we're okay? I challenged, my voice rising slightly. I mean, look at us, we're not okay. Mom just left and everything is a mess. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know it's hard, but we can't let this tear us apart. I want to fix things, I echoed, incredulous. How can we fix things? Mom is gone and you're acting like nothing happened. His eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, I saw something flash across his face. Hurt, anger, maybe even fear. I'm trying my best here, Emily. I'm just as lost as you are. I didn't want this to happen. Then why did you let it? I shot back, the words escaping my lips before I could stop them. Why didn't you talk to Mom? Why didn't you tell her how you felt? He flinched at my words, and for a moment, silence enveloped us. I could see the conflict raging in his eyes, the struggle between wanting to explain himself and the knowledge that I might not understand. I didn't want to hurt her, he finally said, his voice low. I didn't want to hurt you. Too late for that, I muttered, unable to hide the bitterness in my tone. Dad fell silent, the ice cream forgotten in his hands. We sat in the oppressive quiet, both of us unwilling to back down, the distance between us feeling more pronounced than ever. It was as if a chasm had opened up, and neither of us knew how to cross it. After what felt like an eternity, I stood up, leaving the untouched bowl of ice cream behind. I need some air, I said, retreating to my room. I closed the door behind me, the sound of the latch clicking shut offering a small sense of relief. As I sank onto my bed, the tears I had been holding back finally spilled over. I buried my face in my pillow, the muffled sound of my cries filling the room. Everything was too much, the confusion, the hurt, the sense of betrayal. I felt like I was drowning in it all, and I didn't know how to swim back to the surface. Hours passed, and I lost track of time until I heard a soft knock on my door. Emily, Dad's voice came through, hesitant. Can we talk? I took a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to face him, not now, not yet. I'm fine, I called back, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. Please, he urged, his tone pleading. I just want to understand, I want to help. With a heavy heart, I pulled myself up and opened the door, finding him standing there, his expression a mixture of concern and desperation, "Can I come in?" he asked. I nodded, stepping back to let him in. He settled onto the edge of my bed, his posture tense. "I'm sorry about earlier," he began, his eyes searching mine. "I didn't mean to upset you. I don't know how to handle all of this." "I don't know either," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything feels broken and I don't know how to fix it." He looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting as if he were trying to find the right words. "I wish I could take back what happened with your mom. I wish I could make everything right. But you can't," I said, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You can't just wish things away. We have to deal with the consequences." "I know," he replied, his voice filled with regret. "I'm trying to be here for you, Emily, but I feel like I'm losing you too." I sighed, my heart aching for the man I once idolized. "I don't want to lose you either, but it's hard. Everything is just hard." Dad nodded, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I promise I'll do better," he said earnestly. "We'll figure this out together, okay, one step at a time." I wanted to believe him, but doubt still clung to my heart like a shadow. "Okay," I said slowly, my voice tinged with uncertainty, "but it's going to take time." "I'm here for you, Emily," he replied, his voice steady. "I won't give up on us." And in that moment, I felt a tiny spark of hope igniting within me. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hold on to as we began to navigate the complicated waters of our new reality. It was going to be a long and difficult journey, but perhaps together, we could find a way through the storm.